Faithful to Our Errors by Christopher Cole. The fire had long since died, and the camp was still in silent. Ice-colored gradients of first light arched above the silhouettes of an ancient forest. The man lay gazing up, unable to ascertain what of its majesty was material and what of it was a dream. Lids heavy and breath deep, he listened to faint tremors of celestial collisions long past. His eyes opened after the crack of the third gunshot, while an eagle circled above, as a tumbler pigeon shot downward into the tall grass like a drop of blood. The serpent at his feet curled into an ampersand, turning itself over to play dead. He stood up slowly and donned a dust-brimmed Stetson as the mare backed away from the serpent into the sunlight, stamping up the grey ash into crepuscular bars of golden splendor. The man and his horse passed from the camp, leaving a trail through the black hollyhock and the bear's breeches and the dune caps. They rode on through the plains, past vapor-laced hills smoking where their mists convalesced, then along through more aspen pandos, white as bone. They rode past a pale green shimmer of petals that nuzzled the mare's neck, and she neighed between the unanswered love songs of a lonesome bluebird. He meditated on her precise, slumbering steps between thicket and stone. A low branch grazed his cheek, and he plucked a single leaf and held it in his hand, and its faultless symmetry put a burning in his heart he could not name. Then on to the slopes, where the last towering trees stood in line, forming a membrane between them and the glade beyond. Ahead, the early afternoon light danced upon them as they cut between the dark, solemn pillars. The plains stretched away to the northwest, with the Queen City floating off in a long curve, silent above waves of mirage, incanting upward from the fields of tallgrass and cheat. The mare picked her way along the path as her rider cast his glance out upon the pastoral and vacant expanse. The pastel flagstone was befreckled by the paw patterns of prairie dogs. The path led up through orchards of palisade peach trees, where they travelled in echoed quietness, save for the cries of the bird above, spiralling upward upon invisible draughts. Passing an overgrowth of bramble, they came to a long, narrow field, punctuated by a small, white farmhouse. There he saw 2 oxen, with the agitated silhouette of a woman behind them, and just beyond, her 2 children playing. The children chased a felt kite, whose tail danced up and down upon the freshly tilled rows. He jabbed his spurs, and with the click of his cheek, the mare turned in toward the field.
Good afternoon, miss.
Sir,
She said.
How are you today?
I am content.
She replied. The man held his pause.
I saw from a distance something peculiar and thought it prudent to investigate.
I'd estimate it's more unfortunate than peculiar.
She said, as she dropped the reins to the ox's sleigh.
Is that so?
For a fact.
She said while pushing up on her knee to stand upright in the mud. An older man and his cart approached. He walked as if he had already walked all his steps of the day. He set down the cart and plodded over to meet with the woman. His eyes went back and forth between the oxen and the man.
I was just about to tell this traveller that when you went to get hay, the stronger of the 2 started pulling, and he kept pulling until they both were ploughing into circles. I couldn't stop them, and you couldn't hear me yell.
She was holding her hand with a kerchief stained red.
Well, they spiraled into a mud pit of their own device, and now they're stuck. I tried to get in and open the yoke, but they ran down on my hand and caught the latch on a rock, and now it's bent shut.
He dismounted the mare and approached the couple. Each man sized up the other. The elder was in his late 60s, bespectacled and thin but strong. His face was as weathered as the earth, pale, skin like old fruit that never fell off the tree. His eyes looked learned and patient, and there was no anger in them, but they were touched with melancholy.
Well, now one of 'em's stuck in the mud, and all I've got with me is the cart.
There's an axe up on the mare. Maybe we can leverage them out between the two of us.
McKeeby, but you can call me Byron.
They shook, and he turned to the woman.
Mrs. McKeeby.
Oh, I'm his daughter. Everyone calls me Nan.
Widowed. And she's kept his name,
He said, slapping his dusty gloves together, looking beyond.
Boys, come over and introduce yourselves,
said the doctor. The boys huffed across the ploughed rows up to the young man.
It looks like today has given us two peculiarities to consider.
Nan's eyebrow rose.
You see, today we are in the presence of a celebrity. This young man gave us all quite a stir some time back, and I never expected to lay eyes on him again.
Hello,
said the boys together.
Pater Mansfeld. You can call me Peter.
The doctor nodded for Davis to follow him over a distance so the two could talk in private.
You know, I remember a Dr. McKeeby from when I was young. Not sure if there's a relation.
Surely there is, and in the truest sense, as we are one and the same.
Oh, is that so? The dentist,
said Davis.
That's right. Your father used to bring you in for checkups. Might not have remembered you, except for the newspapers a while back. Quite a turn you did on them. Am I to guess that's all in the past now?
Davis turned his head and spit.
all in the past. That could be the story. Else, we're set to see through it all again, I suppose.
McKeeby half smiled.
That does seem to be the nature of it.
He produced tobacco and papers and offered them, not out of ceremony, but with that contemptible gesture of humility which country people confer in a look of subordination.
Thank you, doctor, but I cannot abide.
Oh, I'm no doctor, not any more. They say I retired. But rather, life retired me instead.
He rolled the cigarette with one hand and continued.
Some time back, I was extracting a broken molar from a man who had gotten it knocked sideways in a bar fight he himself had started. Now, from the story his wife told me, she had been flirting with another man, and her husband was having none of it. She said he wasn't worth nothing and drunk all the time, and she was just looking for a reason to quit him. Now, it's generally inadvisable to do any such procedure while someone is under the influence, but this man and his wife and his friends had dragged him into my office, pissed drunk, and he was still howling from the pain. So I got in there with some pliers and yanked it out, as you'd expect. The reason they say you can't have whiskey in you when you're operating is that it thins the blood. And with this young man, his blood was so thin that I severed a nerve in his face and made the entire half of his body go lame.
He dragged hard on his cigarette and gestures with his neck and hands, as if to move the story along.
Well, they get the sheriff, but there's not much he's gonna do on the account they signed away their rights to sue. And for a while, that's the end of the story. Sometime later, maybe 3 weeks or so, I have Nan and the family over for dinner when we hear a gunshot outside, followed by someone shouting my name.
He looks back at Nan, feeding hay to the oxen.
Well, we get up to see about the commotion. And there's that half-lipped dickhead wobbling up my walkway with the biggest cannon you've ever seen in his one working hand. And he's trying to pick it up and aim to shoot it at me. But the rest of his body has gone to shit, including his aiming eye. So there's no real threat there. He says his wife left him on account of his invalidity, and now he wants revenge. But I know better based on her word. I try to chuckle it off, pathetic as it all is. So I go back inside to call for the sheriff.
The doctor takes 2 full drags before he continues.
Well, Nan's husband doesn't see the tragic comedy in it all, and instead leans headfirst into the drama. I suppose he was concerned for his wife and the kids, so that's understandable. Now he's shouting back at the gimp, and so the fella starts waving around his pistol. Well, as I said, I wasn't there, but Nan was, and as she says it, there was a brief altercation, but the fool's imbalance threw him right on top of her husband, and he shot the poor man to death right there on my front lawn.
He drops the half-smoked cigarette and presses it into the earth.
As I'm running back to the front, I see the sheriff already coming up the road, and the man is just circling her husband's corpse. Looking back and forth between her and the sheriff, smacking the butt of that pistol on his temple, half-drooling, crying out, "I apologize." As if apologies are any good goddamn for anything. Well, Nan and the kids looked on in horror, frozen and shocked. And on the 4th circling of his body, he yelled out, "My God, what has become of me?" And he shot himself in the temple right there, and then collapsed on top of her dead husband. It wasn't even 7 in the evening yet. Murder. Suicide. And just like that, the light in our lives was snuffed out.
Peter ruminated on the story in the brief silence between them, and his mind wandered to the tumbler pigeon and the snake. He wondered which of them the raptor caught and which was allowed to get away.
I'm not sure what to say, Doctor.
Well, there's nothing to say about it, son. Not nothing to speak of anyway. Not even much of a lesson. Except maybe the only trouble I ever been in was caused by whiskey. Women, or both, at the same time.
He clapped Davis on the shoulder and rattled off a laugh as they turned their focus toward their predicament. Behind them, the mired ox bleated loudly as the other shook to free itself. Davis retrieved his axe from the mare and met Mackiebe at the plough.
"Thanks, young buck. But I could use the exercise,"
said Mackiebe, taking the axe from Davis.
"You put your boot on his horn and press down, so they don't go thrashing around while I knock 'em free."
The oxen submitted, heads flat on the earth, boot to the horn. Mackiebe broke the lock off the yoke with one fell of the axe. Immediately the outer bull popped the bow and situated itself to get up and free from the mud. The boys were cheering, and Nan clapped as it struggled to freedom. But with its last push out, it leveraged its hind leg against the leg of the mired ox's femur, and with more than a ton of pressure, it snapped the bull's leg in two. Nan fainted as the bull let out a shriek of ecstatic pain so loud and so shrill and so long that the boys joined in the chorus. Davis felt a sickness in his stomach as the events began to catch up to his understanding. The sound of the bone cracking, like dry kindling, the bleating of the bull, Nan on the ground, and the boys utterly wild-eyed with panic and shock. My God, he thought, they had watched what happened to their father, and that man. Mackiebe hauled Nan over to the wooden cart, dragging her backward by the underarms, her 2 feet ploughing trails of mud through the wet earth. He yelled to Peter.
"Don't suppose you got a pistol on you?"
Peter blinked.
"I expected not. Well, Nan here isn't up to the task, so I'll need to run her back to the house and get mine. Boys, stay here with Mr. Mansfeld, and I'll be right back. Best not we all leave, or that bull will just scream louder.
Peter sat with the boys looking on at the mired, broken bull. It had grown quieter, but would bleat out the details of its suffering in broken, uneven bites of sound. Peter looked back to the white farmhouse. McKeeby and the cart weren't even halfway to it yet. The sun headed down, and he needed to make town by night. He stood up, dusted off his Stetson, and without looking up said,
Boys, sometimes it's important to have courage when you're left alone and you're afraid. Do you know what courage is?
They looked on blankly, still in shock.
It's when you know things will hurt you even before you start a task, but you go through with it regardless. Boys, look at me. You must always have courage to do what needs to be done. You hear? Especially when someone or something is suffering.
He looked toward the bull, and their gaze followed. Peter picked up his axe and stood over the beast.
We'll make short work of it. You should look away now.
He brought the axe's full force down on the back of the bull's neck. The blade connected with fur, then flesh, then muscle. The bull screamed and lurched up, biting the bit into its neck, only to fall again on its fully broken and splintered leg bone. Peter lost his grip. The axe, now flailing from the neck of the bull, became lubricated with blood and too tricky to grasp. He put his boot on the bull's head and pulled it out. Twice more it came down, and twice more left very little more than blunt trauma in the neck of the beast. Its cries became smaller and more infantile. As Peter was readying to swing a fourth time, one of the boys cried out,
Mister, stop! He's not dying. You're just making it worse.
The other boy was sobbing and had pressed his face into his brother's shoulder.
Mister, please, stop!
The mare stamped and moved about. Peter knew they were right. He breathed in deeply and looked out past the farmhouse and the city, out past the skirt's edge, where there stretched a horizon of immeasurable splendor. He watched the clouds churn him up, and inward, far beyond our perception, into the fierce cobalt and azure and cerulean heavens. As the bull cried out, Peter twirled the axe upside down, mid-swing, and connected its blunt end sideways directly into the bull's temple. Its eye popped out of its head, and a trickle of blood meandered down from the ruptured dent. Its tongue dropped to the dirt, and a long, low rattle of its suffered breath escaped into the air. He stood for a time staring into the grotesque face of death he had unmasked. Blood began to pool in his muddy footprints, blinding him with the sun's dark reflection. He rubbed his eye and turned to the boys.
Tell your grandfather I had promises to fulfill. And take care of one another. In the end, each other is all you will ever have,
said Peter, mounting the mare. He kicked spurs into the mare, guiding her up and out of the field, back to the flagstone path and onward, away from the pastoral, ordinary goings-on of the farm, a small world, subservient only to the cycles of weather and the staggering indifference of mortality. The sky began to turn as the last warm wind blew down from the mountains. The transparent clouds folded their hides underneath themselves until a dark stain of formless grey spread out to their edges, and a crack like the felling of the axe rattled the window panes of the White House, and rattled the nerves of the mare, and rattled the broken locks still hanging around the neck of the mutilated beast. The winds rose from their treasuries and became colder, until the willows bent as if turned down in mourning, and then that too came to an end. Then, with a muted clangor, A plague of hail fell upon them out of the still air. Peter turned up his collar and, head down, rode onward to the Queen City.